But this week we are talking about interviewing.
Right.
And the art of the interview. And I see you brought notes with you today.
I did, because I got some feedback that I tend to wax on. So I've decided I'll try to be crisper in this session.
All right. Well, we'll get to that. We do not have an article this week.
That's right.
But we are covering the topic at large. So I'll kick off the conversation, I guess. And for people, I guess, let's start with this. Let's start with just what really is an interview, because that is a definition in a word that has changed very much over the last 10-ish years as social media has evolved, because interviews used to be you sit down face to face with the interviewer and you get asked questions. I think of shows like Suits, where you have all those people waiting outside a room, where that's how TV shows represent it. That is not really how it works anymore. Now with the post-COVID advent of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and rest in peace Skype. But I guess let's start with, what is your understanding of what an interview is, like, in your mind? Let's start there.
Well, I think it does depend on the company to some extent. So if you're going in for a very entry-level interview in a big city, and they're pulling candidates from the city, it could be what you described, like in Suits, right?
Family Guy, whatever.
And back when I first started working, I did these interviews in 1988. So I was very, very, very young.
Yeah.
But it was 300 people sitting out in a lobby area, and they brought us in heats, and they did a little spiel, and then, we did group interviews, and then we ended up doing like panel interviews. And so the answer is it depends. But I would say for the majority of professional positions that involve either the opportunity to have a hybrid job, a remote job, or you might be relocated for, you're going to start, and you even did back then typically, you start with an initial, what I will call a screen, and I think that's what everybody calls it. The initial screen is usually with a staffing person or an outside agency, and they've looked at your resume. If they've used AI or they've used any of the services out there, like even LinkedIn does some basic screening. You've probably, I'm not a big fan of it, but you've probably gone out there and taken some tests and answered some questions. If you're going into like a sales or a marketing job, you may actually have to do a demonstration, record yourself. I think some of the jobs that you've told me you've interviewed for, you've had to do like a little tidbit of your skill, making a little video or a movie or something like that. That might be in the screening process. But the interview process, once you kind of get through that, and that's just the hurdle of, do you meet the minimum qualifications? Now, you still want to be professional in that, but when you get to an interview, the purpose of the interview is really for a representative of the company, whether it's a staffing person, because you're going to have several interviews. You're going to have the screen, then you're probably going to have an interview with somebody in recruiting or staffing, and then you'll have an interview possibly with the hiring manager or a series of people, because every position that a company is filling, they're looking for particular things. It's not usually just, are you a warm body, I'm going to bring you in. And so the purpose of the interview from the company side is to assess, not only do you have the skills, which is a big piece of it, but how do you think? How do you organize your responses? How do you present yourself? What experiences have you had that didn't pull through from the interview? Where are your gaps? They're looking for fit. They're looking for personality. And on your end as an interviewee, you should be looking for some of those things too. Is this a corporate culture that's going to work for me or not? Is this the type of job I want to do or not? And so when I interview, and I believe when most HR people interview, and we try to help business leaders see that too, I always say, I know this is a two-way interview. I'm assessing you in the beginning, and I want to leave you time at the end for you to ask me questions that let you assess whether or not this is the right fit for you. Mm-hmm. I've been there. It has not been that long ago that I have wanted a job. And so I will sell myself to that job because I want to make sure I fit. right? And I need to get that job. I'm looking for that job. This is my professional in, or I just can't take where I'm at anymore and I'm looking for another job. Yeah. But you want to be very thoughtful that you are genuine. You don't want to appear desperate. You want to be assertive, but you don't want to be aggressive. You do want to take notes in that interview, because I personally, when I interview people, I'm looking for, can you follow the instructions that I give you? Now, normally I'm interviewing for much bigger jobs, but I interview for every job that comes into HR. I think I mentioned that before. And I also will support interview when my team is overwhelmed and they're looking for somebody from an HR perspective. Usually we look at fit and we're looking at behaviors and things like that. And so it's really important to understand and listen to what the interviewer is laying out. Some interviewers, it's just a mass, I'm just interviewing, so they won't do that. I have specific instructions. I said I'm not going to tell my instructions because I don't want anyone that I might interview to know my secret sauce. But I say, we're going to spend our time in 3 buckets. We've got 45 minutes, we've got an hour. And so I want you to take this much time to do this much time to do this, and then we'll leave this much time at the end for you to ask me your questions. When they can't follow the instructions even at the beginning, for me, it's a no-go. And so that interview is for you to show you have the skills, you've got the right personality, demeanor, interest, but also it's a test for, do you understand the importance, I hate to say this, but of conforming to whatever that particular culture is. So if you're a creative and you're interviewing for an analyst job, that interview is not for you to tell me how you're a creative.
Yeah.
The interview is for you to sell yourself on the job that I have. So that's the purpose of an interview.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think what's something you've mentioned to me, which I think is great, is like, even when you, in the aspect of trying to get an interview, you tailor your resume. And I think what's interesting about interviewing today is that I have interviewed and gotten positions with companies that don't ever have a face-to-face person interview at any point. In fact, for one of my positions where I was a tutor, right, I never talked to anybody on the team the entire time. While getting up to it and doing my first tutoring or whatever, never talked to anybody, never had any connection at any point, right? And I think it's odd because we live in an interesting age where, as a person who's used ZipRecruiter, used Indeed, used LinkedIn, mostly Indeed does this and the other two tend not to. So another reason not to use Indeed, anyone watching, they will now, so many companies resort to not wanting to do a person interview and they just give you a digital interview where they say, record your tidbits and send it in, and then you'll never have an actual interview.
Well, and I can't say that I understand that logic because I have never done that.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm a little bit of a throwback. But that feels to me like almost like a cattle coach. I'm looking for bodies. I don't care that I churn a ton of people.
Yeah.
Just churn. Or, as we talked about in one of our prior podcasts, it could just be that they don't really have a job and they're just trying to create a repository of qualified candidates.
Yeah, with the fake
so if a job opens.
Going on, yeah.
Because I don't quite, now, if you're going to be 100% virtual, maybe I can see it. But I do think that a sophisticated organization, part of the interview process will be meeting other folks. Now, I will tell you that I have had a number of times in my career where I've been interviewing for a later career for a pretty significant leadership role. And if I'm interviewing, whether I was interviewing with the CEO or I was interviewing with the CHRO before I became a CHRO, they didn't have me set up to interview with the people that I thought I needed to interview. Mm-hmm. So I had one company, I ended up not going there, and this was one of the big qualifiers, was I'm like, when am I going to meet with my business partner? In HR, I will spend a lot of time with my business partner. It's like a marriage at work, right?
Yeah.
And they kept, you don't need to meet with them. Well, we're in Lux and we're not really sure which one it will be. I met with all these HR people didn't meet with a single person in the business, and yet I was going to spend 95% of my time with the business and 5% of my time with those HR people. Mm-hmm. When I finally, and this is I have some stories here about interviews, okay. But I want to make sure I hit my tips.
Okay.
When I finally did meet with this particular person to interview, who was an executive, actually I think his title was president of one of these divisions.
Oh, wow, okay.
He sat down, it was our lunchtime. I was supposed to have lunch. I did not get served lunch. Not that that's the end of the world. Clearly, I can miss a meal. But it's a little weird, right? When you have a lunch meeting. He came in with a supersized bag of Cheetos Puffs.
That's crazy.
Ate the Cheetos Puffs, the entire bag, over the course of our interview.
The entire bag?
There was Cheeto dust everywhere. It was all over his shirt. It was all over his face. It was all over.
I have friends who'd be jealous.
Oh my gosh!
The fact you could do that.
All over well, I guess when you're a president, and he was like spitting out little pieces of Cheetos the whole time we were in the interview. It was very off-putting. And it's not just because I was hungry, because I wouldn't have done that. But it is not uncommon to have a lunch interview.
Yeah.
But for someone to do that is really weird. And then he's got Cheeto dusts all over him. Now, this was before COVID. He sucked the Cheetos dust off of his finger and then extended his hand for me to shake it. And I was like, you know what? I'm good. I did not take that job. Now, I had another interview that I met with I think his title was CEO, and he had a guard dog in the interview that sat and growled at me the whole time. That was bizarre, too.
That just seems weird.
And I had been warned that this guy was a little off, and I was like, yeah. And so they called me, oh, we're so excited about your candidacy. I said, this isn't the right position for me. And it would have been this would have been 10 years ago, probably. It would have been a significant opportunity for me to jump.
Yeah.
I knew the person who'd had the job before. It would have got me back to my hometown. There were all these things that were really attractive, but you've got to determine, if you can.
Yeah, when the CEO has a guard dog.
Oh my gosh, and he growled at me.
That's terrifying.
And I even said, I'm a little uncomfortable with your dog, and he said, he's here to make you uncomfortable. And I thought, what kind of relationship is that?
That's terrifying.
I mean, he would have been my partner.
Yeah.
And so I really, as I remember being desperate. I got to have a job. But you really need to think, and in that case, if I had taken it, I probably wouldn't have been able to myself. First of all, I wouldn't have been the right fit. There would have constantly been a conflict because I would have been telling him, that's not okay to do. That doesn't make anybody feel good but you, right? And what about your team members? But if I had taken that position, I don't think I would have lasted more than a year.
Yeah.
And so you want to be thinking about that, especially when you're younger in your career. Don't ever take a job that you don't think that you can get to a year or 2 years, because you don't want a bunch of short little tenures on your resume. That's a red flag, and you'll start getting screened out pretty quickly. You won't even get that interview. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple stories. I have lots. I have lots of stories.
I'm sure we might have to make a part 2.
Oh, wow.
Maybe in the next season.
But I did have this list because you asked me to write down some tips.
Yeah,
so tell me when you're ready for the tips.
So we'll get there soon, but I have one other thing I want to cover, because something that I always thought was intriguing from an outsider's perspective, and something that as summer comes up, it's something I'm maybe looking to do, right, is internships, right? Because we have multiple, like our social media person is swamped, so we want to give them like an intern to help them. But so here's what's interesting is the difference between interviewing for a full-time position and interviewing for an internship, right? I figure that's pretty significant in at least approach, and I find it interesting because I know so many people, like myself included, where getting an internship super easy, not hard to do, right? If I wanted an internship, I could apply today and I'd get 5 responses, right? It's not hard to get an internship, but it's always that translation, right? So I wonder, what is the difference between, I guess maybe it's the termage of internships are short, but I guess from the hiring perspective, right? How do you view those candidates differently? Because maybe you view them very similarly, but I wouldn't be surprised if companies take 2 different angles with how they approach one or the other. But what is your insight?
I don't view them the same way.
Okay.
So when you're looking for an internship, and traditionally, and there's lots of different versions of this now, but traditionally an internship is over a summer.
Yeah.
You have co-ops, that's a different situation. You have part-time students, that's a different situation. But an intern really is going to have a start date and it's going to have a stop date. There's, selfishly, from a business perspective, there's no commitment to this person.
Yeah.
You know they're going to come in and you know they're going to leave.
Yeah.
Some companies, many companies, it's just free labor, right? Or cheap labor, because I believe in paying for internships myself. But a lot of internships are unpaid.
Yeah.
Because you're not working for the money, you're working for the experience. And I think reputable companies will say, I want to bring in an intern because they have a new perspective. They can do some of the entry-level work that I don't necessarily want my more seasoned people to have to do. You are assessing them for, well, would we like to bring them back? Mm-hmm. But there's very little commitment. And so having done a lot of internships over the years, usually it is a basic threshold. Are they a full-time student? Are they enrolled to be a full-time student? Or if that's not a criteria, but I always look at that. Are you enrolled to be a student? Not just, I'm some random person out on the street and I want to be an intern. Have they recently graduated and they're building out their resume? That would be another criteria to say, sure, that's wonderful because I can give them something, I can get something in return, but you're not looking necessarily for that fit because it's months, it's a few months.
Yeah.
And so it's not that big of a deal. Now, on the opposite end, when I'm viewing candidates that have had a number of internships, you like to have internships that are at the same company because it shows that they did a good job and they kept bringing them back. Or you want to see an internship where they've gone and they've done completely different things. And so there's some story around why I did this first. I'm going to use your area. I did video, and then I did technical writing, and then I did production, and then I did editing, whatever it would be. I don't know your field, but that's kind of the fun thing that you would be looking for. And you'd say, okay, even though it's just 4 months, 3 months, 2 months, it shows me adaptability. It shows me that they're interested. And I think if you're interviewing for a internship versus a regular job, you're going to interview differently. You're going to show that you're hungry, you're interested, you're there to learn, you're not afraid of hard work. You're okay with doing some of the lower level running type of stuff. And so it is totally different, and I would interview for them differently because I'm wanting to give you the experience and I'm wanting to get kind of low labor in exchange. I'm not looking for you to come and grow a career and be part of the larger culture as a whole.
I think I always think that's interesting. I don't know. I find because I know, for example, when I was in California about a year ago when I was in California, I remember working for a local film group. I won't say their name. I didn't sign an NDA, but I won't say their name just out of respect. But love it. Great people there. And I remember I worked there, and their method was they couldn't hire many people full-time. So what they did was they focused on having a slew of freelancers available. Mm-hmm. And they would do this thing where I joined on as an intern. I don't even remember what I really joined on in effort of. I was kind of just a production assistant at the end of the day. But after I was brought on as an intern, he brought on a full-time as well, because it was basically this small videography company who just, the guy who ran it with his wife. And it was a really interesting company, and they did a lot of different things. And it's just this one dude behind it all, and he had 2 kids, right? He was supporting with it. And he was working out of an apartment just 1 floor up from his own in this small little kind of almost motel-y complex. It wasn't a motel, but it was in a suburban area in like residential housing. And I remember that the way they interviewed me versus that person, because I was at least in distance when I heard, was very different. And I thought that was interesting. But I also find his method very intriguing, because he would just be like, guys, we have a production this week. Any freelancers available, we'll pay you if you come and work. And it's like, I don't know. It's so interesting to me, that his approach. But after I heard those 2 different interview approaches, and this is one of those things where I interview both digitally and in person, right? He interviewed me via call, And then he interviewed me in person where he printed out and had my resume. And he didn't own a printer. So he had to go somewhere to get it printed. But he printed it out, had it in front of him. And he sat it on the table, and we sat down next to, like, not even bigger than this little coffee table here. It was about the size of that one over there off camera that people can't see. But it was a small little table. And we had that conversation. No, I was thinking of that ever since. Like, I wonder what the approach is differently.
And I would think that a creative approach is going to be very different than
I assume,
because I'm talking about more larger scale businesses, more formalized businesses. But I think it is a great trick, and I do use this. I have a couch in my office. And I have that in there versus some kind of a conference table on purpose, because when someone's made the time to come in and sit down and have a conversation with me via an interview, I don't want it to be cold and formal, because that's what they've been doing with everybody else.
Yeah.
And so I do like to sit down and just, I'll say, by the time I've seen them in person, on the phone I'm different. But I'll say, I just want to have a conversation with you. I just want to understand who you are. That's not going to pop out of your resume.
Yeah.
And I think, personally, I think by that point, I'm no longer screening them for, do they have the skills? Somebody else has done that. Do they have the functional skills? Can they do the job? And as an HR person, I'm probably not the best person to assess that. I can screen for it, but then you, as the hiring manager, need to tell me, do they have it or do they not have it? Because I don't know your job. I don't do your job every day. I'm not omnipotent. But I do think that puts people at ease. And I also think, personally, as the people that are viewing this, be on guard for that. Mm-hmm. Because I get a lot of information out of people that nobody else gets. And I'll have, my peers, SVPs and et cetera, say, how did you get that? I didn't get that out of them. Because it's a very different environment.
Yeah,
now they think they're just sitting down with a friend. Yeah. They have a bottle of water, they have a cup of coffee, and we're just talking for an hour, versus them going through the formalized structure of an interview. Mm-hmm. And usually, because I'm looking for fit, that's a great opportunity. And because I've done this for a while, I can usually assess within 10 or 15 minutes. And then the rest of it's just kind of getting to know you. But be on guard for the exact approach that you said. Not that it's it's not that they're trying to trip you up. It's not that they're out to get you. But that informal approach will often get people to lower their guard. And if they aren't who they appear to be, if they're not who they're selling, if they've had issues in the past, that will usually pop up from that particular type of approach.
From that part of the interviewing process. Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because it's like having the multiple staged part of that, because something I'm thinking, if we do bring on an intern, something I want to do is not only have because I want to, being how small my current company is, right? I want to be at least part of that process, because the way I think about it is, this is the interviewee for our position. One, I want to make sure the person they're working with, who would be my social media manager, is chill with them. And they would do all the kind of breakdown of, can you do this? Do you know how to do this? Right? And that's what my plan was to do a more personal, like, what do you like doing? What are your hobbies? What are you interested in? Because to me, it's like, something I thought was really, and that interview was a big difference in that California situation, but a lot of interviews are so mundane,
They're very structured.
It's just like, so I worked at this company for 4 years because I did this, and this. The reason I left was X, why you break it all down, and it can just get so repetitive. And something I'll say, maybe from my perspective, which I think is interesting, but I don't know if you've ever noticed this. I feel like in smaller, not even smaller companies always, but even medium-sized, small companies, I guess, but like more than 5 people, when you interview someone who's of a higher rank, it feels more like, at least as the interviewee, you have to bring your A game, because I feel like there's so many companies where I have interviewed because there have been multiple companies I've interviewed for where it turned out not to be the same job as we talked about before, but there are multiple where I interviewed with an HR generalist first, and that's fine. I expect that. And then the second round, I talk with someone who's much, 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 much higher up in the company, who may not oversee me directly, but oversees that area of the company. And I don't know. Something about that is like my head clicks as, okay, they are showing me mutual respect almost because they're putting their time out of their day to do this, and I think that's something that might be, but from the interviewee side, I'd actually argue a lot of people don't realize how almost, I don't know what word I'm looking for. What an opportunity it is to interview with someone that high up. And because I was talking to a friend who interviewed for a photography role recently, and they were like, yeah, I just interviewed with their main shooter, and then I interviewed with the CEO right afterwards, and it was just an interview. And I'm like, so what was the difference between the two? It's like, not much, just did the same thing for both. And I was like, I don't get that. That's
Well,
weird.
There's a few things there to unpack. So
Yeah.
first of all, I would say, every screen is going to be that very mundane.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
did I do?
that's
Blah, blah, blah.
expected, I believe. Yeah.
And usually when you're going to that next interview, they're validating the screen, so it's very mundane. My guess, and I don't know where this person interviewed, and I don't want to disparage anybody, but my guess is those are individuals that are not they probably don't interview all the time.
Yeah.
And so, to assume that the person who's interviewing is skilled at interviewing is probably not the best thing to assume, because as a HR person, we're constantly trying to train people how to interview better. But part of that is too, I think that you want to change up your game, and that's one of my tips in here when we get to it about how do you want to approach your interview.
Yeah.
And if you've done, that screen and now you've got an interview and you're going to have a series of interviews, each one of those you want to be a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed with, my manager or even a peer, and then I interviewed with the CEO and it's the same, it tells me they're just not very skilled in interviewing. So you could really wow them by being a skilled interviewee. But I will tell you, my spider senses tingle when I can tell someone's a really good interviewer.
Yeah.
Because that tends to be, in my profession, perceived as some gilding. Boy, they know how to interview. And when we're calibrating, which we can talk about what that is at some point, when we're calibrating with everybody who's interviewed the person, and you hear things like, man, they know how to interview, that's not a good thing. So you want to be human, you want to be skilled, but you don't want to be a good interviewer. You want to appear to be a good candidate who has interviewed well, not a good interviewer or interviewee. There is a subtle difference there.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, if I'm saying interviewer, interviewee. So, and those are some of the tips I put down here. How can you be authentic and real, and hopefully get to that next step of the interview? Mm-hmm. And there are some faux pas that I got to tell you when I get this question at the end, because you always want to have questions. That's one of my tips. But there's two questions in particular that I get at the end that I think everybody from any career center or any book they've read, like What Color is Your Parachute, or any online stuff, you take away that these are two questions you should ask. Don't ask these questions. I mean, they are like, it's like, holy crap. Because if you're me, I'm going to tell you. And some people's ego can't handle the crispness of my response. Other people will just code it over. They'll give you false hope, and then you're going to be disappointed. Yeah. So instead of following the script and instead of being like everybody else, really think about what are the questions that you have.
Well, and something because at least for all the in-person interviews I get, right, most of the time, I would say 80% of the time, I'm a good interviewee, is at least what I'm told, because the way I interview like I talk. I interview very similarly, and I think, at least when I did my California interview, the reason he picked me over the other interviews was because the way I talk and the way I speak is very, approachable almost, and that's what he told me, at least, like instead of being this super rigid, yes, so I worked at this place for this long, I'm more like, yeah, I worked there because I was interested in this at the time. And I was interested because of X, Y, Z. And I'm a little more, now maybe this is something our video viewers can see. When I talk, I'm expressive. I move my hands, right? Which I want to talk about maybe one day, not super related, but presenting, because I think that's something that's very cool for the corporate world, and I think I have a lot of good experience there. But yeah, it works in interviews, because I remember multiple interviews for positions that I ended up not being interested in because of whatever they were, where I know that I would interview super well in the interview and then immediately get called or something saying, yeah, we want to move you to the next stage. And I'd be like, yeah, I'm just not interested in this position. But yeah, I don't want to go on a tangent because we're limited on time. So let's go to what I think you're ready for, which is the tips and tricks of interviewing. And we'll go one by one. Maybe you say one, and then I'll give a reflection, and then we'll keep going. So what's your first tip/trick?
Yeah, well, and I think
guess.
that a number of these are kind of related. So I'll say what it is, and then I'll give you examples of what you should do. So the first one, most important, is to prep.
Yeah.
Prep for the interview. Just because you've had a ton of interviews, don't assume that you are going to interview well for this particular position.
Have a game plan.
Yes.
That's how I think about it.
And how do you prep? So that's where I'm pulling things through. So you want to make sure that, yes, you've read the job description. And I know this sounds intuitive and people are going to say, I always do this, but I would make a checklist for myself to make sure that I've completed all these things. Look at the corporate website. Play around on the corporate website because it will give you a great insight on the culture. Are they a little bit more formal? Are the pictures of the leaders very cold and impersonal, or are they smiling? Do they have a background like the company I work at? We were all told to wear white shirts and dark jackets because that was the culture that the CEO wanted to portray. But I'm more intrigued by ones where they're out and about. You see them with people and they pose. And so it just kind of depends on what you're interested in, but it will give you a flavor. Read a little bit on their investor relations site if they have that. If they're a smaller company, we can talk about that in a minute, but do research. If they're a bigger company and they're public, listen to an earnings call. And you can find that either by just Googling, Pepsi earnings call, GE earnings call, whoever earnings call, and listen. You may not understand a lot of what you're hearing. That's okay, especially if you're newer to career, but you'll hear the voices of the leadership. Mm-hmm. And, that's when you want to use your feel of, well, how do they talk? How do they present? Earnings callers are going to be very formal. They're going to be pretty flat. But do you hear inflection in the voices or do you not? That will help you assess what that corporate structure is like. And a lot of that's going to funnel down, right? And if you're a creative, it could be off-putting, but because those are very formal calls. But at least you'll begin to understand how they present things. You'll also understand the questions that investors ask them. So it will help you think through, well, what kind of questions might I want to ask? And I might know that, hey, they're trying to do this as something new. Oh, they have a big video campaign or they're rebranding because that'll all be in that earnings call. And so I think that's a really important thing to do. I know they can be boring. Sometimes they can be almost an hour. Sometimes I've listened and stopped and taken notes. You can also get a transcript if you.
I do both. I do the transcript while watching,
yes,
and I highlight
do too.
On the transcript.
And the things that I think are interesting. But it's really important to take that step, and especially if you're more mid-career. I ask most of the people I interview, oh, have you looked into the company at all? Have you listened to an earnings call? And when they don't know what an earnings call is, that doesn't mean I'm not going to hire them, but I'm like, you didn't even make the effort.
Maybe because I know a lot of people in my generation don't know what an earnings call is. Could you explain an earnings call for those people?
So earnings calls are required for publicly traded companies. For a smaller private company, this is a little bit harder to get, but you can Google around and get the information. An earnings call is required. Usually it's the CEO and the CFO, and they will break down the profitability or the loss of the business. They'll talk about the initiatives that they're driving. The earnings call is designed for an investor who's buying stock in the business or an investing company who's going to encourage their portfolio to buy stock in that company. It talks about all of the things that are going well. It talks about things that have been distractors. It's going to talk about branding. It's going to talk about new markets. It's going to talk about finances. You're going to learn a lot about the company. And then at the end, you get to hear those investors, which are usually over large portfolios. It's not usually an individual person. In fact, I don't know if I've ever heard a question from an individual person. They're going to ask questions that really get into the meat. And they might say something like, yeah, you showed profit for that quarter, but I couldn't help but notice that, you didn't have a lot of cash on hand. Well, that may or may not be important to the people watching this podcast, but you can listen to how the company responds to that. And it will help you think through, is this a company that's, have had some trouble and they're trying to get out of that trouble, because that would influence the questions you want to ask. Or is this a company that's sailing high and, everything they touch is gold? Then you're going to ask different questions, right? But that's the purpose of an earnings call. It is legally required by the SEC that we talk about what is in our income statement. And we have to put out, every quarter we have to put out a report. And this is going through that, and it's more the story that you're not going to get from the physical written material. So companies are trying to put their best foot forward, don't get me wrong, but you get so much insight, and I don't even know that I knew to listen to an earnings call until I was probably close to 40. Mm-hmm. And now I'm like, even companies I'm not going to go work for, but maybe are suppliers of ours that we struggle with or customers of ours, I'll still every now and then go out and listen to an earnings call because you learn so much.
What I like looking into about companies, when I'm looking into companies, I look at I don't know what it's called, but they're like yearly, quarterly breakdowns. Because a lot of them are published online.
All publicly traded companies have to publish it.
Yeah. Those I like seeing. I like reading into those because, now this is nerdy, not super into this realm of reality here. But that's how people who play games operate, right? Mm-hmm. We follow the companies and follow their quarterly stuff because they announce projects to their investors. And you hear stuff like, so we're working on a sequel for X, and then you'll have Twitter go, oh my gosh, guys, we have a sequel for that game 15 years ago. But
that's where you learn so much.
You learn so much about what they're doing. And it's super insight, because a lot of people wonder, how do you get this information about these companies? Yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, guys, go listen to an earnings call. And it's crazy you're not taught that. Maybe you're taught that in business school. I don't know. But nowhere else in education will they tell you about that. But let's move on to your second tip for time's sake.
Yeah. Well, and another thing I want to say about that is it's really impressive. When someone, without me asking, because usually I'll ask that at the end, without asking, if they say, hey, I listened to an earnings call, and that's part of their questions, or if I ask them, why do you want to come work here, which I don't usually ask, but let's just say I do. Then you can say, well, I was listening to your earnings call, and these are the things that really excited me. If it's true, don't make stuff up.
Yeah.
But you got to have a story. There's always a story. I tell you this all the time, right? You have to go beyond the story. Okay, so that was about earnings calls. I already talked about trying to understand. So here's another big tip. I realize it doesn't always happen because not everybody is as sophisticated as they should be. But leverage social media, things like LinkedIn and other professional sites, to try to figure out who you're interviewing with.
Yeah.
I always say, I don't know if you went out and you stalked me on LinkedIn, but I'll say that to leaders sometimes, because if they didn't even take the effort to go out and figure out who am I interviewing with, what is their background, it doesn't really show me that you're curious and you're interested. Another reason you want to do that, which is a little bit lower on my list, is you can find commonalities with those people. So let's say, for example, I'm interviewing you, and you come in for a job, and my LinkedIn profile is out there. I post things periodically. If you were to say in the interview, I was really interested about this particular post that you put out there. Don't freak me out by saying in 1999,
1952.
But you had this really interesting post out there that I thought was interesting. It was, and you had something. I do this periodically. I want to say, calling all technicians or calling all sales and marketing people because we have a job and we're trying to get interest around that job. That shows me again that you're curious, that you're interested, and you're going to find something that's going to set you apart from all the other people that I'm talking to, because you took the time to go look at something and you're interested in something that I've done.
Yeah.
So it comes down a little bit later too, is you want to make it personal. So you don't want to stalk people to the point where, you are somehow creeping them out. But, what's out there in LinkedIn is certainly within bounds, and you should feel comfortable and free to be able to, use that. Or say, I was looking at your company's LinkedIn page. Or Facebook, but that's probably for much, much older people. And, I noticed that you had these things that you posted. All of that's perfect. Not a problem at all. I definitely do that because it makes you different than the herd, and you want to be different than the herd. Mm-hmm. You want to prepare for some behavioral questions because it won't all be about tell me exactly everything that you've done. Mm-hmm. Or if you can, weave in behavioral answers. So you had said, I went here because of this reason. Talk about, while I was there, these are the things that I learned. Mm-hmm. You want to focus on the positive, not on the negative. But if you say, hey, I was really interested in camera work. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to make it to you as a creative. So I had this internship, but after I did it, although I enjoyed it and I learned all these things, I was like, I'm not really sure that's my passion. So that's why the next one was a little bit different. And mm-hmm. so if you can tie in that,
explain the story.
Yes. And talk about the things that, focus on the things that worked for you. But I will always ask the question, hey, what do you not like to do? And I think I talked about that in another interview. And so be thoughtful about having a legitimate response to that, not just some flippant or some textbook example of, why you don't like to do certain things. Make it personal. You want to make sure that you've tailored your responses to this job, right? And so,
yeah, you've talked about that.
Yeah. And so that's really, really important. I think another thing is from all of this, make sure you're practicing.
Practice it for the interview.
So sit down with your resume, think about different questions, and we can even pop some up, or if we ever do a live one day, people can ask me what are the top questions that I've used in my career. I'd be happy to share that. But, practice. I practice for almost every presentation I ever give. Now, I interview so much I don't practice anymore, but it hasn't been that long ago that I was also interviewing for jobs as I was moving up. And I would anticipate and practice my response. I'd practice what I was going to say about my resume. I'd practice different questions I thought I would get asked. I practiced different questions I was going to ask and follow-up questions within there. So practice is your friend. I go in my office, I walk around, I talk. I probably over-practice because I'm an introvert and I'm an INTJ, follow the Myers-Briggs. So I'm all about perfection, unfortunately. But practice. Here is another real important thing, because so many of these interviews are on Teams or Zooms or whatever. Look professional on camera. Make sure that it doesn't look like you just rolled out of bed. Here's a story. Mm-hmm. I literally interviewed somebody, and you cannot make this stuff up, not that long ago, for an entry-level data person in my organization, but it was in HR. He had on a shirt that now we're all adults here, so I'm going to say some things that might be, a little racy. I'm not really sure what was on the shirt, but I became obsessed with trying to figure out what was on the shirt. Mm-hmm. It was either a middle finger flipping me off or a penis. I'm not really sure which. But it was in the center of a circle, and it looked like somehow the word at the top of the circle, it looked like F-U-C-K. I couldn't quite tell, but it was definitely U-C-K. And at the bottom, I could tell it was just U. Mm-hmm. And he had a flannel over top of this shirt. So the whole time I'm watching this, and he's laid back on a couch holding up a phone like this. I let the interview go the whole hour because I was obsessed with trying to figure out what was on his shirt. I was hoping he'd move so I could see it, because I'm like, that can't be what I'm thinking. And what is the thing in the middle of his shirt? Is it a penis? Is he flipping me the bird?
Probably a middle finger, because I think I know the shirt you're talking about.
Oh my gosh, who wears that to an interview?
Yeah, that's crazy.
And that's an extreme. And then, of course, I had to talk about it with, all of my peers. I'm like, I can't believe what happened to me today. But be professional. Be at a desk. Think about what your background is. If you're interviewing interviewing from your dorm room, put in a fake screen or something, or put some kind of a background. Don't show your bed. Don't show dirty laundry. This is your opportunity to shine, and you don't want the impression that I took from that, and that's one of many, but you don't want that to be the impression, right? I already talked about trying to find that common ground, which is why you want to stalk them, right, and figure out what's going on. And then here's another one. So I mentioned this earlier. Make sure that you've got a couple of questions at the end.
Yeah.
Make sure that you know enough about the company, or during the conversation of the interview, questions might pop up. Jot them down. It's okay to have a piece of note paper and be writing it down, and even to organize your thought. I'm always impressed when I say, hey, we're going to take this hour and we're going to break it down into these 3 sections. When I see them jot down, and when they come back and say, okay, so I want to make sure I understand what you've asked me for. So you want me to do this, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. Okay. Or if I ask a multi-phased question, which I often do for more higher levels, if they'll write down and say, okay, I took 3 things that you want to know, boom, boom, boom. Did I get that right? That shows that you're listening. It shows that you're organized. So that's really important. At the end, I said, these are questions that don't ask. Whatever you do, if this is my opinion, don't ask the question, do I have everything that you're looking for? Or
oh, God.
Why would you not select
God.
me? I get asked that question a lot by, like, let's say individuals going, they've been professionally working 4 or 5 years, and they'll say, hey, why do you think I'm the right person? Is there anything that I don't have that you're looking for? Most people will skate over that and be like, oh, no, this looks fine. And then you're going to be disappointed because you're going to think, oh, I'm the ideal candidate. Mm-hmm. When I get asked that question, immediately I'm off put. But usually when I get asked that question, I know that they're not the person. Yeah. And they know that they're not the person because of the questions that I've asked. And so I'll end up saying, you're not the right candidate for me. And here's why. I think I break their spirits. Mm-hmm. And they want to justify why they have something. I'm like, this isn't a debate. You didn't ask me a question for a debate. Yeah. You asked me my feedback. I'm giving you my feedback. We're not going to be pursuing you as a candidate. I don't like to be that person either, but I'm not going to skate over it and let them think, oh, I'm going to get a call. I'm going to tell them, you're not going to get a call. We're done with you. So that's one question. Please don't ask that question. And I think it is so arrogant. It is such an arrogant question to ask. If you want to know something, what you might ask instead is, there were a couple specific things that you were looking for that I know I don't have. There's a couple things. You're looking for somebody who has experience editing, and I know I don't have that. But I'm interested in learning about that. That might be a way of saying it, not trying to flip it back on me as the interviewer, but say, I know I don't have that, and you said that you were looking for that, but I'm interested in learning it, or I'm studying that, or, this is a passion of mine. That is a better way of doing it. I don't know that it's going to help you at that point, but if you feel compelled and you absolutely have to say something, find a different way to say it. The second thing is, and I know I've given Jayke this advice, is be careful when you ask for what's your timeline. There's an appropriate way to ask for it, and there's not an appropriate way to ask for it. It's probably better to say, can you lay out for me what are the next steps? Or, if I'm going to hear something, do you have a timeline that you're looking to fill the job? That's probably a great way of wording that question. But to say, when will I hear back from you? And I have people be that blunt. When am I going to hear back from you? Probably if you're interviewing with a hiring manager, they don't know. Yeah. Because there's a bunch of candidates. I try at the end to say, you're at the very beginning of the interview group that I'm interviewing with, or you're at the tail end. It's probably, I'm looking at maybe a couple more weeks before I get through these, so don't expect to hear something right away, because I do try to answer every question. I think a lot of people will just blow you off, and you'll end up getting, passive-aggressive responses versus real information that's going to help you. But I think it is important to say, hey, if this is true, do not use this if this is not true. But it's okay to say, look, I have some other opportunities that I'm looking at. I'm getting out of class or out of school, or, I have summer internships coming up, and I'm going to have to be making some decisions too. So, do you have a relative time frame that this is going to come through? Because I'd hate to miss out on this opportunity because something else came through quicker. Be honest and transparent if you do have other positions that you're pursuing, but don't use that if that's not true, because it will backfire. And so my entire career, these things have been important.
Next week, I guess, we'll be talking about diversity.
I think that'd be a
equity, and
good one
inclusion.
because it's really hot.
So-
I'm feeling passionate about it.
Very passionate. So we'll probably do that next episode. I'm sure there's many. Well, heck, we could just talk about the executive orders.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much we can cover. But, yeah, so that'll be the end of this episode, everyone. Thank you for coming, video and audio listeners. And we'll see you all next week, which, when this is posted, will be February 7th, 14th, 21st will be this episode. Next episode's the 21st. This one's the 14th. Is when this one comes out, I think. If I am wrong, comments, go crazy.
Edit that out.
The whole week. No, I'm keeping it in. They'll have to figure it out. All right, but thank you all for watching, and we'll see you all next time. Goodbye, everybody.